I'm going to be presenting my work on the contribution of mobile individuals to the dynamics of asymptomatic carriage reservoirs, and this is part of the MARS project. And my supervisors are Professor Jean Gadal and Dr. Jody. Okay, so just to give a brief overview, 95% of malaria cases are in Africa. And my study is mainly focusing on the Sahel region of Africa, and mainly two countries, Senegal and Mali. And of note, Senegal and Mali both missed the WHO's 2020 milestone to reduce malaria incidence and mortality by 40%, despite them actually implementing different control strategies, which include early diagnosis and treatment, chemoprevention, and vector control. So this brings us to a question of what is the problem and how can we further reduce transmission? So, for instance, vector control is difficult to enhance because of outdoor biting and also insecticide resistance. In terms of early diagnosis and treatment, it has limited impact on transmission. And this takes us to the issue of asymptomatic reservoirs, which is what my topic is based on. And of note, we know that 40 to 80% of individuals remain undetected using field tests, and they end up being untreated and constitute the asymptomatic reservoirs, and thus enable persistence and then trigger seasonal outbreaks. So one of the interventions that has shown that it can help in reducing the issue in handling the issue of asymptomatic reservoirs is mass drug administration. But even that has some problems, that has some challenges that need to be addressed. For instance, there's the issue of participation in the MDAs, and there's also the issue of reintroduction of the parasites after the MDA has been done by people who are mobile. And this includes people who are moving from the area where the MDA has happened, going in and out, and it also includes those that are just newly introduced. Those are the newcomers. So in light of this, it is really important to adapt the intervention to the region, to the Saharan region. And currently, there's an intervention, there's a project called Amereti that our team is going to be involved in Senegal, in one of the regions that this study is actually done in. So to take you to the main objectives of the main objective of my project mainly is to understand how parasite importation by mobile individuals can influence the efficacy of potential interventions against the reservoirs. And to do this, we've staged it in a number of parts. The first part is just to describe the Plasmodium falciparum prevalence. The second part is to describe mobility, and then we'll estimate infection in asymptomatic individuals and also in the symptomatic. But for now, I'll just discuss the first 3 points. So the MARS study, the MARS project was an open cohort. Data collection was already completed, and it was an open cohort of households in Senegal and in Mali over 12 months. And it included 4 villages from eastern Senegal, and also 2 villages from Kati, which is central Mali, and 2 villages from Dire, which is northern Mali. And all of that, the total was 1,433 participants. And the survey was split into, the study was split into 4 surveys, the first one being at baseline T0, and the last one being at T3. And during those 4 surveys, infection was being detected using RDTs and qPCR, and also questionnaires on social demographics and behaviors were given out. And in addition to that, there were irregular visits detecting infection using RDT. And we also had weekly mobility follow-up where they asked the participants about their travel. So moving on. In terms of methods, to describe the Plasmodium, we described the Plasmodium falciparum prevalence, basically the qPCR positives using per survey, which is the T survey, the baseline up to the end. And we also defined mobility profiles using survey questionnaires. So for the survey questionnaires, this was declared mobility, and it was done retrospectively. So there were many questions asking these people to basically give some information about their travel between the survey period. And for that, we use PCA and HCPC to come up with the mobile profiles. And the second one, we described mobility using the weekly mobility follow-up data. This was from the weekly visits. And basically, we just estimated the frequency of travel during the follow-up period between each T survey. And lastly, we identified the association between mobility and Plasmodium infections identified by qPCR during the 4 visits. All right, so now I'd just like to take you briefly into the results. I haven't finished this analysis, so I'm just going to share some preliminary results. So firstly, in terms of participation, there was equal distribution in terms of age, in terms of gender, sorry. And then 61% of the participants were under 20 years. And over 82% of participation, with most participation during the first survey, which is T0. And in terms of the overall prevalence per survey, which is what I've shown in the figure over here, you see that in T2, the prevalence was highest in T2 and lowest in T3. And using the PCA method and the HCPC, we came up with 3 mobility profiles, with the first profile basically including those people, those observations or individuals who do not travel. And the second one is those who travel moderately. So that's basically for less than 1 week to visit family and within the region and using different modes of transportation. And the last one, high mobility. These are those who travel for more than 1 week, less or more than 1 week for various reasons, and they go beyond the region. That's the main difference with the moderate ones. They go beyond the region. And in this part, I would just like to slowly take you into the distribution of travel across the sites. So as I mentioned, we have 3 sites. So what we see here in each panel, you're looking at the visit and per each site. So in this case, I've just taken out Kedegu just to give you an example of what we see in our results. So to start off with T0, I've just randomly picked the visits. So we'll start off with T0. In Kedegu, this was the dry season. And what we see is that those most of the observations had low mobility, with the least being under the high mobility. And if we compare that with the T2, which is the rainy season, what we see is a similar pattern with those with most observations under having low mobility and the least observations and high mobility having the least number of observations. And one other interesting thing of note is that if you look at this, you'll notice that moderate mobility was lower moderate mobility compared to T0 was lower and approximately about 40% of T0. So this is basically now having all the sites together. And I'll just draw your attention to the red box just to give an example of just one visit. And what we take out from here just by looking at it, you already see that the mobility patterns are different across the sites, even just by one visit. And what we also see when we looked at Senegal and also when we look at this figure, we see that it's also different per visit. Yeah. And moving on, we're going to do a similar thing. We're going to start off with looking at Kedegu per visits. And in this one, we're looking at Plasmodium falciparum prevalence. And what we see is in T0, we see that those with high mobility had higher prevalence of Plasmodium falciparum. And if we compare that to T2, which is the rainy season, you see a similar pattern. But however, it is almost double that of T0. Proceeding, we're going to do the same thing as we did, just looking at one visit. And what we see is that the Plasmodium falciparum prevalence patterns are different across the sites. And in addition to that, they are also different across the surveys, which is also what we already saw by just looking at Kedegu alone. And so because in light of this, the differences between the sites, For the generalized additive mixed models, we did it per site because they have different patterns. So we separated each analysis per site. And what the outcome variable for this was Plasmodium falciparum PCR positivity during cohort survey. And the exposure variables were mobility, profile, age group, gender, and visit. And we also added random effects for village, household, and individual because of how our data is structured. And observations with no qPCR were excluded from the analysis. I'll just take out an example of one of the sites, and I'll use the same category, and I would like to draw your attention to the ones that I've highlighted in red boxes. So we'll note that high mobility increases odds of Plasmodium falciparum infection in Kedegu, but however, this result is not statistically significant. We also see that those that are aged 15 to 24 years have greater odds of Plasmodium falciparum infection. And there's an increase of odds in Plasmodium falciparum infection during the T2 survey, which is sort of similar to what we saw earlier. And so that summarizes some of the results in terms of looking at the T surveys themselves, which is declared mobility. So now I want us to look at the frequency of mobility between surveys. This is from the weekly follow-up data. And basically, we're just looking at percentage of weeks traveled during the follow-up period between surveys. So people are followed up regularly every week, asked questions of where they went and also how long they were there for. And of note, Kati, which is one of the sites, sorry, I forgot to mention it, I think. Kati, which is one of the sites, had no weekly mobility follow-up data. So it was not included in this part. And overall, there was low mobility. So this is a crude number for the 12% for Kedegu and 3.7% for Dire is crude. But if you look at each visit, there's also a difference in terms of in terms of travel per each visit. So what you get in this figure that I have shared here, basically you're just looking at the percentage of weeks traveled during the survey follow-up period by site and visit, excluding those who do not travel. Because as you can already see, there's a lot of people who do not travel. So we put those out. And for those that traveled, most of them traveled for less than 50% of the weeks during the follow-up period. So you can use the figure that I have shared here to understand what the periods mean. And there was higher mobility in T2 for Dire, higher mobility frequency in T2 for Dire, and for Kedegu, it was in T1. All right, and this is just for the weekly mobility follow-up. We did a similar analysis for the generalized additive model, looking at the frequency of travel within the surveys, and this is just showing a spline for the percentage of weeks traveled. And what we see from Kedegu, this is from Kedegu, and what we see from Kedegu is that there's a nonlinear association between the percentage of weeks traveled and asymptomatic carriage after adjusting for age, gender, and the survey. But however, these results are not conclusive. And lastly, we tried to compare between the declared mobility during the 4 surveys, comparing it to the weekly follow-up mobility, which was actively recorded. And what we found in this is that there is a mismatch between the declared and the actively recorded mobility. So overall, from everything that we have seen so far, we see that there is no association between mobility and Plasmodium falciparum carriage. And we also note that prevalence patterns are different across the sites. And this can be because of varying in nighttime activities, adherence to preventive measures, type of work, rainfall patterns, or treatment during previous survey and between surveys. And in terms of the difference between mobility patterns in the 3 surveys, this can be due to the type of work that they do in those sites. And it can also be due to the rainfall patterns which may affect mobility. And the mismatch between declared mobility during the T surveys and actively recorded mobility during the weekly follow-ups, it's likely due to information bias, but there's need for us to look more into it. And another thing is we noted that those school-aged and young adults have got higher odds of asymptomatic carriage. And that can be due to differences in age-specific factors. It could be due to age-specific factors. So therefore, for mobility to actually have an impact, there must be heterogeneity or a transmission gradient between the home and destination, or difference in behaviors. And there's also the issue of seasonal transmission in the destination area, i.e., is there ongoing transmission where the people are traveling to? And this figure is just basically it's just an illustration to just give you an idea of what I mean. So if, for instance, if someone is coming from, it would matter if someone is coming from high to low. Or if someone is coming, for instance, sorry, I forgot an arrow, from high to none, then mobility would actually matter. So in terms of, I would conclude with considerations for my next steps. And I'll start off with next steps in terms of asymptomatic carriage analysis. In light of everything I've shared, it is clear that there is a need to include travel destination. There's also a need to include behaviors such as nighttime activity, bed net use, and treatment during previous surveys and between survey. We could also consider limiting the analysis to the high transmission period. We could also investigate the relationship between age and mobility patterns. And there's also a need to consider doing an analysis on the effect of mobility on symptomatic malaria. And lastly, we could also distinguish between parasite lineages. Basically, this is just to look at the genetic distance between parasites in people in a village. Thank you very much for your attention. I will conclude here. Thank you.